So yeah, my name is Alba and I work at the Norwegian Computing Center. And in this talk, I will introduce you to the work we did with collaborators from the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research and the Icelandic Marine and Freshwater Institute on deep domain adaptation applied to automatic fish age prediction. Let me just present you the outline of the talk. I will first introduce you the motivation of the study and how the automatic fish age prediction can be achieved by using deep learning on images of earstones, which are called otoliths. I will also talk about the problem faced when we try to train deep learning methods on images acquired by new labs that do not provide labeled images. And to deal with this problem, I will then present our proposed methodology, which is based on unsupervised domain adaptation. And then I will show you some results and discussions that are motivating our current line of research on this topic before concluding the presentation. So to understand the motivation behind this work, it's important to know that in marine research and resource management, the estimation of the age distribution of fish stocks is key to maintain sustainable fisheries. So one of the procedures which is used for age reading requires humans experts to examine images of otoliths, which are these earstones or calcified structures, which are located in the inner ear of the fish and which are extracted once the fish is caught. The problem is that the manual age reading requires the experts examining very precisely the annual growth zones and actually counting them. So to determine that an otolith belongs, for example, to a 12-year-old fish, the reader may have different ways to arrive at the same conclusion as highlighted in the blue dots that are present in the otolith image. And this makes the process challenging, but also time-consuming. Therefore, automating it would be very good in order to help getting the age distribution of the fish stocks in a more efficient manner. So neural networks have been trained on otolith images from the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research, and the obtained results were promising, as published recently in a couple of papers. So when looking at the model predictions against the true age predictions, as you can see in the scatter plot presented at the bottom of the slide, we see that the model predictions are not located very far from the main diagonal. You may also wonder why the scatters have different sizes, and this is because they have a radius which is proportional to the probability density of the data. So if applied on similar image environments, we would expect that the classification models should have the same type of performance, and we call these similar models the source domain. However, the performance of a classifier trained in the source domain will suffer substantially when deployed in new field environments. As you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, we now see that in the new environments, suddenly the model predicts ages which are completely far off from what the human's prediction were, and we call these new environments the target domain. What happens is that there is a domain shift between the source and the target domains, which is actually induced by different luminosity conditions or experimental setups. For example, we have the presence of tags in the upper part of the image of the target domain, and you also have in the source domain some shadow zones that are present on these images. And in addition to that, we may not have labeled images in the target domain to retrain the classifier. So taking all this into consideration, what we propose in this work is to investigate one approach of unsupervised domain adaptation that could be applied to automatic fish age prediction, such that already trained neural network models could generalize to novel otolith images without the need of extra labeling effort in the target domain, and such that then the performance gap that we observe from the source to the target domain is then handled. So there is a large number of proposed methods for unsupervised domain adaptation, and we propose here to investigating only one of these approaches. So our approach uses different information in different neural network components. So images and labels from the source domain are used in a source classifier, and then we use the images from the source and the target domains in a domain adaptation component. Finally, the images of the target domain are used in a target classifier component. So note that the domain adaptation component and the edge classifiers share some parts of the architecture. So let's start with the source and target classifiers. They actually correspond to the neural network model, which was trained for automatic fish age prediction, presented in the paper that I mentioned in the introduction. That used the images that were coming from the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research. So you may recognize in this architecture the VGG19 model, including some batch normalization, and only the classification unit was slightly modified. So moving on to the domain adaptation component, it is actually based on the COGAN's design that was presented in the Liu and Tuzel paper. So the COGAN consists of a pair of GANs, GAN1 and GAN2. But before I start describing the COGAN, let me just comment that there are plenty, again, of other generative adversarial approaches that could be used in unsupervised domain adaptation and that we could have used. But here we decided to focus on COGAN because it has shown some promising results on other domain adaptation tasks. So what happens is that the generative models take as input noise a vector z and synthesize images g1 of z and g2 of z. Then the discriminative models estimate the probabilities that the synthesized images are either real or fake. And these discriminative models, they share the same architecture than the classifiers models presented in the previous slide, excluding, of course, the classification layers. So as done in the original Liu and Tuzel paper, what we do is that we tie the weights of the first few layers of the generative models, and we also tie the weights of the discriminative models. Finally, we can solve a minimax problem by using the following value function that appears at the bottom of the slide. And just one comment is that the weight sharing allows to learn a joint distribution of images without corresponding supervision. So we solve the edge classification problem in the source domain together with the domain adaptation problem. And the domain adaptation problem gives us one loss, and the edge classification problem gives us another loss that we can then combine to obtain a total loss that we can optimize for. Finally, our target classifier is used, as I said previously, to predict the edges in the target domain. And note that in the entire process, we did not use at all any of the target labels. So we experimented with otolith images from the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research, which was our source domain, and otoliths coming from the Icelandic Marine and Freshwater Research Institute, which was considered as our target domain. So in our experiments, we used two different versions of the data. The one that we denoted baseline, and which is basically the original otolith image, resized to 224 times 224 pixels for training purposes. And then we have the standardized data, where the images are transformed to suppress differences in non-otolith background and to suppress also differences in size of the otolith structures. But note that the whole process did not affect the pixel colors of the otolith. So basically what we are trying to do is to keep the original shape of the otolith. So we used 3,505 training samples in the source domain and a little bit less in the target domain, 2,280 training samples. We also use a small validation set of images to choose hyperparameters for our models. And once we were happy with our model, we decided to train it for 5 different runs with exactly the same hyperparameters, and we reported the results on a target test dataset. So we evaluate the performance of the models in terms of root mean square error between age predictions and read age by human experts for the two versions of the data, the baseline and the standardized. So to better understand the presented table, let's pay attention at the second column, which actually corresponds to the lower bound model. By lower bound model, I mean the trained model using labeled data from the Norwegian lab, using no domain adaptation at all. And then we have the upper bound model, which is the last column. This is the model trained on the target data from the Icelandic lab, with now the age labels revealed. So in both cases, we use the BGG19 architecture. So these two columns serve as soft indicators to quantitatively evaluate our Kogan results. So the result that we need to take away from this slide is the one which is highlighted here by the blue rectangle. So basically is that the standardized domain adapted results are better than the baseline. As you can see with the numbers indicated in brackets, we achieve a better error reduction rate from the lower bound model with the standardized data. Finally, over the 5 different runs, the results do not vary a lot. As you can see, the root mean square error remains relatively stable in the two situations and is constantly lower for the standardized data than for the baseline. Let's now look at the model predictions against the human predictions to evaluate in a more qualitative manner our domain-adapted results. So on the left, we have our lower and upper bound models, where we see that the lower bound model in black completely overestimated the ages compared to the upper bound model in red. So this trend is actually corrected when applying domain adaptation, as shown in the second and third scatter plots, where we compute the median over the 5 different runs per predicted sample. So when comparing the baseline results with the standardized results, it seems that the standardized results are also giving results which are closer to the upper bound model. And this might be explained by the fact that the domain adaptation problem is much simpler once the data are standardized, as the model can focus more on the internal part of the otolith, ignoring possible noise that is present in the background. So this brings me to the discussion. Just to summarize what was done up to now, we exploited a label otolith dataset from Norway and a neural network that achieved a good performance on those images to automatically predict fish age of unlabeled otolith images from Iceland. So I presented in this talk an unsupervised domain adaptation method based on Kogan that showed very promising results in improving the performance compared to a lower bound model and achieving results which are close to the upper bound model. All in all, what we also observed is that the results were improved when preprocessing the data using standardization. However, we found out that even though our approach was based on generative adversarial networks, it did not rely on a successful image generation process. So what do I mean by that? You can see at the top of the slide some images generated by our generators G1 and G2 from our Kogan design. So the first row corresponds to images generated with source style, and the second row are images generated with target style. So they do not resemble by any means to the original otolith images with the original colors and shapes, and this is not a problem of image normalization. But yet, these images were sufficient for a reasonable fish age prediction in the target domain. So we suspected that the quality of the generated images had to do with the chosen architecture. Actually, the adversarial domain adaptation component was using a discriminator that shared the same parameters as the source and the target classification components. So these observations have motivated our current line of research, where we would like to investigate whether the predictions in the target domain could be improved by successfully generating otolith images from the adversarial domain adaptation component of our Kogan design. So for that, inspired by the Generate to Adapt paper published in 2018, we decided to modify our training process. So originally, this is what we had. We had source images that were used in a classification branch to predict the ages. And then we had a second branch, which was corresponding to the adversarial Kogan architecture. What you see is that the classification branch received as input the output of the source discriminator. So we decided to change this process such that we introduce a feature extraction network that was generating now images such that we take the source images, we generate features, and we input them into the classifier to predict the edge classes. So this is one change. And in addition, we also changed the way the input was generated for our Kogan design. So basically, we combine a random vector generated from a normal distribution together with some embeddings that were based from edge labels coming from the source domain and also features extracted from the source domain, but also features extracted from images of the target domain. And in this new process, we also decided to simplify the discriminators compared to what we had before. So let's now look at some results. So we decided here to focus on standardized images, and we compared the results from the Kogan we originally used and the modified version I just described. So as previously, we report the results on the target test dataset after training the model for 5 different runs using the same hyperparameters. So when looking at the RMSC plot over here, we observe that the modified Kogan approach leads to very similar results compared to the original Kogan. So then when looking at the model predictions here against the human predictions, what we see is that there is not a clear improvement with the modified Kogan approach, despite of the fact that what we see is that the generated image with the second approach are far more realistic than what we had in our original approach. Now you can see at least some colors that are respected for the otoliths, but as well you start to see some shapes that are generated that are realistic, for example, the fingers of the otolith, and also the internal structure, which is actually called the nucleus, that appears. And before it was not the case. So this concludes this presentation. I shared today my experience with working with unsupervised domain adaptation based on the Kogan, such that the age of the fish was predicted by training models from unlabeled otolith images and labeled images from a source domain. So the presented approach did not seem to rely on successful image generation to obtain reasonable edge predictions in the target domain. And by the way, this may be a topic that we may take further in the discussion in a few minutes. And in the future, we would like to compare the proposed method with other unsupervised domain adaptation approaches or other semi-supervised approaches. Thank you for your attention.